Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Lowest Crime, where we dive into some of the most notorious true crime cases from the Netherlands. I am Eline, and today we're exploring a case that shocked the town of Middelburg in June of 1990. This is the story of the unimaginable finding of a human head left at a bus shelter, and the dark layers of humanity that led to this grim discovery. Before we dive in, please note that today's episode includes descriptions of violence, mental health struggles, and dismemberment, which some listeners may find disturbing. And while I try my very best to bring you all the known facts, I am but an amateur podcast creator and there is always a chance of me making a mistake. So, let's dive in. Press photographer Ruben Oreel was out early on the morning of June 6, 1990, after receiving a page stating that something was going on at the bus stop. Thinking it was most likely a fire or an accident, Oreel was surprised to initially see nothing out of the ordinary at the bus stop. Apart from the police tape and the investigative team. He happened to know one of the police officers, so he asked, "Hans, what's going on?" Hans stammered, "Don't talk about this with anyone, but just step over the line." He looked for less than 2 seconds, but he would later state that he would never forget the image. It had been just after midnight earlier that day, when a local man, whose identity remains unknown until this day, walked through the normally peaceful streets of Middelburg. Known for its historical charm and serene atmosphere, the town was about to become the center of a shocking event. As the man approached the Generaal-Major Berghuiskazerne, a military barracks by the Molenwater, something caught his eye. As he approached the seemingly ordinary bus shelter, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A severed human head, grotesquely displayed on the bench, with no sign of the body it once belonged to. The man, understandably horrified, quickly contacted the local police. For some reason, he chose to remain anonymous. The choice may have been driven by fear of becoming a suspect, disbelief, or simply the overwhelming shock of what he had just witnessed. Whatever the reason, his call set off a chain of events that would have the town talking for years to come. At first, the police were skeptical, as were many residents of Middelburg. The notion of a severed head left in a public place was so horrific and so incredibly out of place in this peaceful town that it seemed almost too shocking to be true. So, as often happens in small towns, speculation ran wild. Was it a prank or maybe a gruesome misplaced art project? But as more details emerged, the horrifying reality began to sink in. This was no joke. It was the scene of a brutal and possibly premeditated crime. As word began to spread, the bus shelter became the focus of intense public and media interest. What had once been a mundane stop for commuters and schoolchildren was now the epicenter of a gruesome investigation. The head was later identified as belonging to a woman, a revelation that deepened the sense of unease, especially amongst the female population. The police, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, sealed off the area and launched a full-scale investigation. And with that, usually so peaceful Middelburg suddenly became the site of a massive police operation. Detectives, forensic experts, and members of the mobile unit, MA, descended on the area, their presence a stark contrast to the usual calm of the Molenwater. The entire vicinity was cordoned off, and the investigation began in earnest. Ruben Oreel, the press photographer, was there as well to witness it all. At some point, he noticed a police officer carrying a cooler across the Molenwater and decided to take a photo. The image later appeared on the front page of the newspaper, sparking speculation that the cooler might have contained a severed head. However, the officer, Jaap Tolhoek, who was involved in the investigation, later clarified that this was not the case. Although the cooler would later be used for that exact purpose, the moment the photo was taken, the cooler had been empty. He recalled how he had been asked to buy a cooler that morning, and had even tested it by placing it over his own head to see if it would fit. This anecdote, though grimly humorous, highlighted the surreal and unsettling nature of the investigation. The police knew that they were dealing with something far more sinister than what they had initially thought. This had been placed in the bus shelter deliberately, almost as if the perpetrator wanted it to be found. This act, calculated and cold, suggested a level of premeditation that was deeply disturbing. The question on everyone's mind was, who could have done this and why? As the investigation progressed, the police focused on the area surrounding the Molenwater. Divers were brought in to search the murky waters, hoping to find more evidence, perhaps the rest of the body. Officers combed through the nearby parks, under bridges and along pathways, looking for any clues that might shed light on the identity of the victim or the circumstances of her death. The police worked tirelessly, knowing that the longer the investigation dragged on without answers, the more fear, anxiety, and speculation would go through the town. Middelburg's residents, who had once felt safe in their tight-knit community, were now locking their doors and looking over their shoulders. The sight of police cars and forensic teams on the streets served as a constant reminder that a brutal crime had been committed and the perpetrator was still out there. Then, on June 8th, 2 days after the head was found, a significant breakthrough occurred. Forensic experts, working around the clock to identify the victim, finally succeeded. The severed head belonged to a woman named Antoinette, known to her friends and family as Nettie. She had been reported missing just a few days earlier, on May 30th, 1990. This was the worst way she could have been discovered. Nettie's identification sent shockwaves through Middelburg. She was not just a nameless victim anymore. She was a member of the community, a person with a life, friends, and family. Those who knew her described Nettie as kind, a cheerful woman and well-liked by everyone she met. Her death, and the manner in which she was found, was incomprehensible to those who had known her. The realization that someone they knew and cared about had been a victim of such a gruesome crime was just absolutely devastating. And with this, the investigation took on a new urgency. The police, now armed with the identity of the victim, turned their attention to Nettie's personal life, looking for any clues that might point to a motive or a suspect. It was during this phase of the investigation that they began to focus on Nettie's husband, Ton in 't Hage. Although he appeared devastated by his wife's death, his behavior since her disappearance had raised red flags. Although he had been the one to report his wife's disappearance on May 27th, he appeared confused and also asked to not publicize her disappearance. The police decided to take a closer look at his actions in the days leading up to Nettie's death. In the meantime, the story of the head found at a bus shelter turned into a national story. Journalists from across the country descended on Middelburg, eager to cover every detail of the investigation. The media frenzy added to the town's growing sense of unease. Middelburg, once a quiet, unassuming town, was now the focus of intense public scrutiny. The case had touched a nerve, not just with the local community, but across the entire country. As the investigation deepened, a troubling picture began to emerge. Nettie and Ton in 't Hage had moved to Zeeland in 1986, hoping to leave behind a troubled past and start over. However, their new life in Middelburg was far from the fresh start that they had envisioned. The couple's relationship was strained by financial difficulties, substance abuse, and frequent arguments. The people that knew them described their relationship as volatile, with constant tensions. The police learned that Nettie had been planning to leave Ton, a decision that may have been a final straw for her husband. Ton, already struggling with mental health issues, may have seen Nettie's decision to leave as a betrayal, triggering a violent response. The police, now convinced of Ton's involvement in his wife's death, decided to bring him in for questioning. Ton was interrogated over several days, and as the questioning continued, the inconsistencies in his story became more apparent. He initially claimed that Nettie had left him and that he had no idea where she had gone. However, under pressure from the investigators, his story began to unravel. The police confronted him with evidence that contradicted his version of the events, including witnesses who had seen the couple arguing on the day Nettie was last seen alive. Finally, on June 12, 1990, Ton Int Ha confessed to the crime. He stated that she had been addicted to alcohol for a long time, and that on Sunday, May 27th, they allegedly had another argument about it, during which she hinted that she wanted a divorce. He had then threatened to commit suicide. He also stated that during the argument his wife had tripped, and that when he wanted to help her up, she had said that she wanted to die, and that he had to be the one to do it. Although he later stated that she hadn't actually said the words, but he had seen it in her eyes. He says that after that his hands were drawn to her neck as if by a magnet, and that he then continued to squeeze until she was dead. Out of fear that she might still be alive, he also tied a cord of a pair of headphones tightly around her neck. Realizing what he had done, Ton panicked. He knew that he had to hide the body, so he wrapped Nettie in garbage bags and hid her in the crawl space of their home. After the murder, he went to some friends, where he told them that he had taken his wife to Den Haag because she was drinking again. As the days passed, the smell of decomposition in the house became unbearable, and Ton knew that he couldn't keep his wife in the crawl space any longer. But for some reason, maybe due to the rigor mortis, he was unable to get her out. He spent several days trying to figure out what to do with her body. Eventually, he made the horrific decision to dismember her. He used a hatchet to sever Nettie's head from her body, an act that he later described in chilling detail. The process, he said, took him nearly 5 minutes, a gruesome, deliberate act that only added to the horror of the crime. He stated that the head needed to be found, and so he had planned to leave it at the police station. But when there were too many people around, he changed his mind and decided to leave it at a bus stop. The rest of Nettie's body remained hidden in the crawl space of their home, wrapped in garbage bags, a grim reminder of the violence that had taken place within those walls. The discovery of the body, coupled with Ton's confession, provided the investigators with the evidence they needed to charge him with murder. Ton Int Ha's trial began on November 16, 1990. The courtroom was packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and members of the local community who were eager to see justice served. The atmosphere was tense, with many people still struggling to comprehend the brutal nature of the crime and how anyone could have been able to commit such an act. The prosecution presented a compelling case against Ton, arguing that his actions were premeditated and that he had carefully planned to murder his wife. They highlighted the methodical way in which Ton had dismembered Nettie's body, as well as his attempt to mislead the police with false statements during the early stages of investigation. The prosecution also emphasized the brutality of the crime, pointing to the sheer horror of finding Nettie's severed head in a public place as evidence of Ton's callous disregard for human life. On the other hand, the defense sought to portray Ton as a man who had been pushed over the edge by his mental health struggles. They argued that Ton had been suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and paranoia in the months leading up to the murder, and that his actions were the result of a mental breakdown rather than a premeditated murder. The defense called upon psychiatrists who had evaluated Ton to testify about his mental state, describing him as a man who had been unraveling under the weight of his own inner demons. The trial was marked by an intense debate over the nature of Ton's actions and his state of mind at the time of the murder. The defense argued that Ton's mental health issues should mitigate his responsibility, while the prosecution maintained that despite these issues, Ton had shown a clear intent to kill his wife and cover up the crime. On November 30th, 1990, Ton Int Ha was sentenced to 4 years in prison for killing his partner. At that time, this was a common punishment for this type of crime. Nowadays, someone committing the same crime would get at least double that prison sentence. It was, however, clear to the judge that this was not a murder committed by a professional criminal who wanted to benefit himself, but a combination of mental health issues and struggles within a toxic relationship. Due to this very specific combination of circumstances, the risk of reoffending was estimated to be minimal. Ton Int Ha only served 2 years and 7 months, which raises the question of where he is now, so many years later. Very little is known, but what is clear is that on October 28, 1993, his life came to an end, in a way of his own choosing. Based on these words, one would think that he committed suicide. However, it turned out that he had a brain tumor, which made life unbearable, and therefore he chose euthanasia. What the exact location was of the brain tumor remains unknown, but one can only speculate if the growing tumor had something to do with the terrible act he committed on May 27, 1990. And with that, we conclude our story about the head found in the bus shelter. Thank you all so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. And also, don't forget to follow The Lowest Crime on Instagram to find all images related to the case. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.